I try to imagine a fellow smarter than myself, and then I try to think, what would he do?
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. I'm your host, Jesse Lawler, excited to bring you the 76th episode in this podcast dedicated to the betterment of your own brain by any and all means at your disposal. This is a late night edition of Smart Drug Smarts. It's almost 2 o'clock in the morning as I record this, but I've got to head to an airport and get on a plane, and I'm not going to have much quiet time available to me in the next couple of days. So in order to get this one out in time, we are pulling a late night recording session. I'm helped in this by my friend caffeine, which is got some residual traces kicking around in my system from a big coffee that I probably drank at about 11 o'clock at night. Didn't actually have any other nootropics of any exotic nature today. It's been an off day for me, just bringing myself back down to baseline levels of everything, but I do that every now and then. And I guess appropriately for this non-pharmaceutical day for me, this is a non-pharmaceutical episode of Smart Drug Smarts. We're going to be talking futurism and ethics and the societal implications of some of the technologies that are coming online now and are going to be available in the near future with a philosopher from Ireland named John Danaher. John is somebody whose work I came across probably 6 or 7 weeks ago, and I've read a bunch of his stuff now. I mean, he's very prolific, so I still have barely even dented his full catalog of work, but enough that I reached out to him and said, hey, can we talk about some of your speculations and opinions and philosophical work about the future? And he was kind enough to say yes, and that is the conversation that you're about to hear. If you hang around until the very end of the episode, in the ruthless listener retention gimmick, I'm going to tell you an apparently scientifically proven, tested, and working method of reducing pain if you see that pain coming. This might be something that you already know about or at least knew about intuitively, but apparently it works, and if you don't know about it, it's kind of a neat little trick. So hang around for that. But, as usual, let's kick things off with This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts. This Week in Neuroscience.
So, further evidence for my highly non-scientific study, intuition, whatever, showing that an uncommon amount of neuroscience research is going on in Canada. This Week in Neuroscience is also about a Canadian study at the University of Toronto. Quite interesting finding that there's a fairly common gene mutation that makes the carriers more susceptible to emotional information than people that have sort of the standard version of the gene. How do they study this? How do they even know what they're looking at? They're looking at a deletion variant of a gene called ADRA2B, which is basically missing a couple of links in the DNA chain compared to the standard version of that same gene. This study looked at 39 Caucasian University of Toronto undergrads, which a little more than half of them actually had this particular mutation. Although the prevalence of this mutation seems to vary within human races, in these Canadians it was quite common. In a study of Rwandans, the deletion variant was found in just 10% of the population. So they showed people visual images, some of which had no emotional content. They were just kind of like boring stuff, had some people doing boring things. Others had overtly negative content, like people with horrible injuries or nasty stuff, and others that were pleasant, had nice emotional content. So they took these images and then they degraded all of the images by putting some basically like static video noise over the top of them. So it's not a perfect image. They showed them to these people and then they asked the people to rate how obscured each of the images was. And for people with the normal version of the gene, they didn't see that much difference between the emotionally charged images and the more neutral images. Whereas the people that had the gene variant mistakenly perceived the emotionally charged images as being much, much clearer. It's as if the image became richer or more available to them because it had this extra layer of emotional importance or salience. So a really interesting finding that something like our perceptual visual system can actually be gummed with by the emotionality of something, and not a small percentage of the population. This was over 50% of the Canadians. And I am happy to report that we picked up a 5-star review for this podcast over the past week from listener MEG1979. This is iTunes, by the way, that I'm talking about. Emmy said, finally, an informative biohacker without an overblown ego. Thank you. Also want to throw out a big thanks to all the people that have entered information into the Smart Drug Smarts audience census that I talked about last week and that I will now talk about again. If you go to smartdrugsmarts.com/census, there's a little questionnaire that'll take probably no more than 5 minutes time to fill out. We're hoping to learn about you, our listener. as much as we can in this month of May. So it's May 14th as I record this. We're going to have the census open and available for the rest of this month. This is not one of these nasty tricks to get you to sign up for a bunch of spam. We would never do that to you. We are asking for your email address. We'll sign you up to the weekly updates about what's going on in the Smart Drug Smarts universe. But that's actually a pretty cool thing. It's not a bad thing to have. It's easy to unsubscribe from if you don't want it. And really the overt goal of the census is to learn about what you like about the podcast, what you want to hear more of, and help us kind of dial in the content and the guests that we're going after to make sure that it's things that people other than me are going to like. I know I'm going to like it because I always like all the weird stuff we do on this show. But one more time, just bordering on obnoxious, smartdrugsmarts.com/census.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So what you're about to hear is a conversation with John Danaher, who is a lecturer at the National University of Ireland at Galway, a blogger at philosophicaldisquisitions.blogspot.com, former PhD student specializing in the philosophy of criminal law, and a self-described person as being overtly interested in technology, ethics, philosophy, and law. I used to have some friends in college, and we would talk about in-the-closet smart people and out-of-the-closet smart people. And John is definitely, he would have fallen into our category of out-of-the-closet smart people. There's no question. You read a couple sentences of this guy, and he's talking about things that only intelligent people would even care to even think about, much less write about intelligently. You can definitely tell he's got some formal philosophical training, and it comes across in his writing, his word choice, his subject matter. And I'm not really much of a formal academic myself, and normally I don't really read much of this sort of writing, the stuff that John does, but the subject matter that he's into is really, really interesting to me, and so I found myself reading one thing after another after I stumbled onto him a few months ago. I think the first article that caught my attention was an analysis of the dangers of an artificial intelligence explosion and what that might mean and just how scared people should be. So anyway, I reached out to him. I thought it would be great to have a conversation, and what you're going to hear is us essentially nibbling around the idea of moral enhancement, what it might mean to use various technologies, not just to make ourselves smarter, but to guide our moral intuitions beyond what our physiological baselines might offer, or our cultural baselines for that matter. So I'll drop us in now with John Danaher.
I think one way of just starting to look at this topic is to take a very general perspective on what is enhancement and how do humans relate to technologies. How could we classify a technology as enhancing? One problem with the concept of enhancement is it's a very value-laden concept. So anytime a person refers to something as an enhancement, it sounds like an improvement, it sounds like a betterment. And so people often go like, well, how could you possibly have any issue with a technology that enhances as human beings? I think the problem there is that we need to draw a distinction between enhancement in a very narrow domain of activity or cognition or behavior versus enhancement, all things considered. So, one type is relative to, let's say, a particular cognitive capacity like memory. We could talk about a memory enhancer. And then the other one is relative to the person's life as a whole, whether the memory enhancer enhances their well-being, all things considered. One thing I would urge when people are talking about different enhancement technologies is that they be careful about the scope of their claims. Really, I think it's most meaningful to talk about enhancement technologies in a very narrow sense relative to particular capacities or traits and not in a general sense. And there's a huge amount of confusion, I think, in like ethical and bioethical debates about enhancement because people aren't very good at drawing those two distinctions.
Thinking about things that could be cognitive enhancements without overt negative secondary effects would sort of be the realm that we're most interested in.
Like that's the dream or the hope, is that you get a technology that just enhances in the narrow domain without any of these deleterious side effects or effects on other capacities or traits. Like even within neural enhancement debate, people like to draw a distinction between different kinds of mental capacity or behavior that we might want to enhance. There's the kind of traditional cognitive processing capacities and traits. And then there are maybe the emotional capacities. So people talk about emotion or mood enhancement as well, now as being a core area of focus. The area topic that I'm maybe most interested in is this whole idea of moral enhancement, enhancing moral emotions like empathy and sympathy for others, or our sense of justice, or like anything that's linked to moral behavior. So, one thing about that whole concept of moral enhancement is that it cuts across a lot of different domains of cognition. There's that kind of abstract reasoning based on moral principles principles, and then there's the quick and dirty intuitive responses to other people, empathizing the emotional responses to them. And actually one thing that's interesting, I guess, from the study of human behavior is that it seems like we need both of those things to engage in what we call moral behavior, because if you're too abstract and rationalistic, you would probably meet the definition of a psychopathy. And if you're too emotional and intuitionistic, you will also engage in kind of negative behaviors, or you won't be able to think about certain long-term consequences of your actions. And that makes it very difficult to actually decide whether something is a moral enhancement then, or how we would enhance morality.
The example I always like of moral confusions is the person who's standing next to the railroad track that has 5 people are going to be run over if you don't do anything. Could you walk us through that example?
There are 2 classic trolley problems, as they're called. The first one is where you're out one day walking beside a railway track and there's a trolley car that's out of control. You see it hurtling down the track, and in front of it there are 5 people on the track, and for whatever reason they can't get off the track in time. So you can imagine this in different ways. So let's imagine they're all tied to the track for some reason. So if the trolley car continues on its current course, it's going to crash into them and kill all 5 of them. There is, however, a lever nearby which will divert the trolley car into a side track. And then on the side track, there's one person. And again, we assume that they can't get off the track. So if you pull the lever and divert the trolley car onto the side track, it'll crash into the one person and kill them. So you're faced with this classic moral choice. Do you flip the lever and save 5 people but kill one? Or do you do nothing and just leave the trolley car crash into the 5 people and kill them?
But the blood is not on your hands, or at least so it seems in that second case.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's an interesting question as to whether inaction is as blameless as action. I do this with students all the time, and there are some students who prefer that line of reasoning. They say, well, it's better not to get involved at all. I didn't set up this dilemma. I didn't tie the people to the track, so it's somebody else's fault. They're on the hook, morally speaking.
It's interesting, though, because you can always press that to like an absurd length. Well, what if it wasn't 5 people to one person? What if it was 1,000 people? At some point, I feel like everybody probably has their limit where they would force one person to be run over manually to save a larger number. But where that threshold is for different people, I think could be very different.
Yeah, that's a good point as well. That I think most people will feel the pull of the moral calculus, the kind of utilitarian argument at some point. Where that point is for different people is going to vary a bit. But just to get back to it, I mean, that first setup, when they perform experiments on this, when they ask people what they would do, the vast majority of people say they would flip the lever. They would kill 1 to save 5. And then there's another variation on it where the same essential setup, except this time there's no sidetrack, and you're not standing beside the railway car, you're standing on a bridge over it, and there's a fat man in front of you. This is a little bit more outlandish, but you've got to suppose that, you know, you're a good, like, intuitive physicist, and you know that if you push the fat man onto the track in front of the trolley car, he would slow it down sufficiently. It would be such that it would prevent it from crashing into the 5 people, but he would be killed in the process. So you got, again, this moral choice. Do you push the fat man or not? And most people in that second dilemma will not push the fat man. Even though the moral calculus is the same, like the general moral principle that we thought was operating in the first case, kill 1 to save 5, doesn't seem to be operating in the second case.
Pulling the conversation back a bit to how one might go about trying to morally enhance people. People have intuitions all over the place. Some people would choose one side of the trolley dilemma. Some people would choose the other side. How do we even know what the correct moral choice is? So if we were trying to do an outside intervention to enhance people's morality, we would know which direction is the right one to sway people in.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really good point. I guess the critics of the whole idea of moral enhancement will say that actually what is moral and is not moral is radically context dependent. It depends very much on the particular problem that you're involved in. And so you can't talk about enhancing people morally in general just by, let's say, spraying them with oxytocin in the hope that it'll make them be more empathetic or more trusting of others. I feel the pull of it to some extent, but I'm not sure if it's a major objection to the idea of moral enhancement, insofar as I think there are certain contexts of decision-making in which we have a fair idea of what it is for one choice to be more moral than another, and we might also have a fair idea of what kinds of things we need to do to enhance a person's behavior in that context.
It seems to me like the argument against moral enhancement would be analogous to saying, well, the criminal justice system has problems, so we shouldn't have a criminal justice system. It's kind of outlandish when you look at it that way. Just because we don't know exactly how morality might be enhanced doesn't mean that it's not worth trying or exploring in some cases.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, just to dwell on the example of the criminal justice system for a moment, one thing we might say is that it's important that judges, when they're deciding cases, aren't swayed by biases towards particular individuals. That's a general truth for all decision-making in the criminal justice context. And if there was some technological means whereby we could alter their reasoning such that they aren't biased by, race or gender of a defendant or a complainant, that would count as a moral enhancement in that domain. That's kind of my view, that we should focus on the specific domains of decision making when we're thinking about moral enhancement. The other thing to get back to the original point we were talking about is the method of enhancement, the technology that you actually use to enhance the particular trait that you're interested in. I guess you could enhance through pharmacological drugs. You could enhance through some kind of brain stimulation or brain implant device. But there are also then like traditional methods of enhancement that people talk about. Education as a type of enhancement, or reading a book that exposes you to a certain type of moral reasoning could be classified as a moral enhancement. What proponents of enhancement often like to do is to draw analogies between these traditional methods of enhancement and these more kind of biotechnological methods of enhancement and say, well, look, we've always used these external methods of enhancement like books and education, and we think they're perfectly acceptable. So why should we have any opposition to these biotechnological forms of enhancement?
That seems like a pretty persuasive argument to me. When people object to the idea of having more internal methods of moral enhancement, where are those objections coming from, you think?
I think it could be coming from actually more moralistic intuitions about tampering with human biology. The notion that what is natural is good is common in lots of cultures and societies. I grew up in a Catholic country where the influence of natural law thinking is somewhat pervasive, and this notion that we shouldn't tamper with the given. So our internal biology is given to us, so we shouldn't tamper with that. I guess that mightn't be plausible to you either, since we always tamper with things externally anyway.
Yeah, well, when we think about the plasticity of the brain, in a way, a child's brain is being tampered with at a very, very biological level from the time it's born and even before then. So it's really a question of just how we're tampering, not are we tampering.
Part of that, I believe, is driven by the fact that we haven't fully embraced a materialist or physicalist understanding of the human mind or the human brain. If you're a physicalist, you believe the mind is dependent on physical phenomena. It's completely unsurprising that changing the environment around the person alters their brain in some way. The reason people treat alterations to the brain or discoveries of alterations to the brain as being significant is, I think, largely because they haven't fully embraced a materialist or physicalist understanding of the mind.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And people probably don't recognize just how much their brain is constantly in some sort of dynamic equilibrium with their environment and their neural inputs, what they're paying attention to.
Yeah, exactly. I think this is probably a good point to bring up this notion of the extended mind thesis. This is a concept that was introduced in the philosophy of mind by David Chalmers and Andy Clark back in the late 90s, although I guess the idea might predate that. So the claim is that the mind is somehow dependent on physical phenomena. There's not a soul or a separate plane of reality in which the mind exists. Traditionally, then, the belief is that the mind must be the brain, dependent on the brain, because it seems so obvious that there's a very close correlation between proper brain functioning and proper mental processing and reasoning. So there's this type of physicalism that says the mind is identical to certain brain states. What Chalmers and Clark were doing in that paper, they were disputing that notion, and they were relying on a theory in the philosophy of mind known as functionalism, which holds that the mind isn't really any particular physical phenomenon. There's nothing special about neurons when it comes to generating mental phenomena. What matters is that you have physical objects standing in the right kinds of causal relations with one another. So there's no reason why, let's say, for example, a computer with the right kind of physical organization wouldn't be able to instantiate a mind. Like any physical system with the right pattern of organization can instantiate a mind. That's one of the key ideas behind the functionalist theory of mind. And it's this notion of what they call multiple realizability. So what Chalmers and Clark were doing then was saying, well, if the mind is multiply realizable, it's also probably jointly realizable. And the example they used to motivate this was a thought experiment. Philosophers love thought experiments, involving two individuals they called Otto and Inga. So Inga was just a cognitively normal adult human being, and her memories are stored in her brain. So in the thought experiment, she had to remember where the Museum of Modern Art was in New York. So she had that information stored in her brain, and one day she had to go to an exhibition, and she was able to retrieve it from her brain. So we would say in that case, her act of remembering was generated by physical activity in her brain. We had to contrast her then with Otto. Otto had some kind of memory impairment. He was an amnesiac of some sort, but he has some sort of impairment that prevents him from storing long-term memories in his own brain. So what he has instead is a notebook. And the notebook keeps track of all the information that he needs on a day-to-day basis. So when he has to go to the Museum of Modern Art, he just flips to the relevant page of his notebook where he finds the address and the details of the exhibition, and then he uses that. And so what Chalmers and Clark said was that in the case of Otto, the mental process of remembering was jointly realized by the brain and the external bit of technology, a very primitive kind of technology, a notebook with a note written into it. And this is the other example, which is used by Andy Clark in some of his writings, is the film Memento.
Yeah, he's got the things that are important for him to remember tattooed on his body.
Yeah, so he has all the information tattooed on his body. And so the tattoos are an extension of his mind, just as Otto's notebook is an extension of his mind. So their point is that both Otto and Inga have a mind, and the mind performs similar functions. It just uses different physical systems to perform those functions. And then they use this to generate this theory of the extended mind, that the human mind can extend into technological artifacts that are outside of the skull, outside of the brain.
And it's worth also mentioning that this could apply to things well beyond memory, too. You could do the same thing with mathematics and whether you use a pocket calculator versus doing it longhand. So there's lots of different operations that could apply to.
Yeah, we could have some kind of technological artifact that supplements many different cognitive processes. Again, you could have it with morality as well. There are devices that are being sold nowadays. The Pavlok. It's a kind of behavioral training device that's based on classical conditioning. So the Pavlok administers an electric shock to people if they're doing something that they shouldn't be doing. And the idea is that this will train them to behave in an appropriate way over time. So that's like a type of extended mind device that might be used to improve moral behavior. And Andy Clark would kind of agree with the point that we were raising earlier on, that humans are extending their minds into their environments all the time. Every new bit of technology is in fact some kind of extended mind supplement. Your smartphone is a kind of external memory storage device and keeps a lot of personal information, and maybe keeps more and more personal information the more integrated it becomes into our day-to-day behavior.
I find the extended mind hypothesis very, very persuasive. I would love to maybe hear the flip side of the coin of people who don't buy into this. What are some of the objections?
So the traditional objections to the extended mind hypothesis is that there's some important difference between internal brain-based systems and systems that are kind of jointly realized across the brain and the external environment. And just to mention a couple of them, and we'll use memory as an example here because that's the most kind of widely discussed case. People talk about internal memories being dynamically integrated into an entire cognitive framework, a way of understanding the world. So it's fairly widely known now that the brain doesn't store information like a notebook stores information. It's not static. It doesn't stay in one place, and it doesn't remain the same over time. The very act of remembering involves a reconstruction of a memory, not a retrieval of a memory from some hard disk. Another supposed important difference between the two is that, well, I'm going to use this concept of fungibility, so that external memory props may be more easily replaceable than internal memory systems. And I guess this relates to a final point, which is that even Clark and Chalmers would say that there's a qualitative difference between actually recalling the information based on an internal resource versus using the external memory storage device to restore it. So that's kind of the critical view, that there are these important distinctions between cognitive processes that are based entirely on internal brain-based systems versus cognitive processes that are spread out between the brain and the external environment.
It seems to me that probably decision-making is the strongest objection that somebody might have, that you don't want to outsource the actual decision about what to do with all the information that we have access to something external, because at that point, it's a machine making executive decisions for us rather than ourselves. And maybe that's where people feel a bit more of a threat.
Yeah, that's an interesting topic in itself, because if you were a staunch proponent of the external mind hypothesis, you may not have a problem with that, because the claim being made by somebody like Clark or Chalmers in relation to Otto and his notebook is not that the notebook is something external to Otto. I mean, their claim is that the notebook is part of Otto. It's part of his mental system.
It's really interesting because that definition of a mind makes a mind so much more fluid as far as what it is. If Otto loses his notebook, then a part of his mind is gone. I mean, obviously, that's not like necessarily a big emergency. He can replace the notebook, but to have parts of our mind appear, disappear, and be so transient, I think is just a very unusual idea for people to wrap their own heads around.
That is the key kind of perspectival shift that you need to make if you want to embrace the external mind hypothesis fully. I met a guy last year, this guy called Burkhard Schaefer from Edinburgh University, who made this argument that when it comes to ownership of technology, and if we embrace this external mind hypothesis, we should be much more dubious about kind of centralized systems of ownership over technology. So his example was they use robots now to assist certain patients with dementia, or there's certainly a movement towards the use of robot assistance for patients with dementia. And those robots are reliant on software programs that are updated by a company centrally. His point is that, well, if the human becomes really reliant on this robot assistant, such that the assistant and the human kind of form a symbiotic partnership and that the mind is spread out across both entities, we should be much more suspicious of kind of centralized systems of control over the software.
What's your own personal take on the extended mind hypothesis? You've looked at this from all sides and heard all the objections.
Yeah, so I think there are salient differences between kind of internal brain-based processes and processes that are spread out between the brain and some piece of technology. But I think that the differences should lead us to an opposite view when it comes to the enhancement debate. Now, most critics say, well, no, the internal systems are so much more precious and valuable, so we should be much more wary of interfering with them, and we should be much less concerned about the external forms of enhancement. I think actually the differences speak in the opposite direction. So I think that it's because the internal systems are so valuable in comparison to the external ones, we should be looking towards internal forms of enhancement rather than external forms of enhancement. And like one of my arguments here is that, kind of to get back to the patient with dementia and the robot, is that we should be worried about ceding control over decision-making and control over our cognitive processes to external automated-based systems.
Let's look at that for a second, because I feel like there's the implicit assumption there that because something is physiologically inside of us, that there might not be the ability for an outside entity to still be involved in it. I mean, I could think of something like Google Glass, if that was an internal component that was put inside of our optic nerve rather than being something you wear on the outside of your head, it would still count as an internal upgrade, but it would certainly still have the involvement from this outside entity, Google, which sort of seems like it splits the difference a little of what you were talking about there as far as internal versus external enhancements.
Yes, it could do. The difference, or the important difference, might be how the Google Glass or the implant, let's say, is integrated with the biological system. And does it simply leave the biological system intact and offer a kind of a supplement to that system? Or does it actually really change the processing or functioning of that biological system? And then the second question is in terms of the ownership and control over the technology. So that might be a reason not to favor something like an implant, which has a bit of software in it that's controlled by and owned by some other external agency, as opposed to maybe a pharmacological enhancement, which, once you take the drug, it can't really be owned or controlled by anyone else. So that might be the distinction. But the argument I would make is that the degree of integration into the traditional brain-based processing systems is important, and that there are reasons why we should favor forms of enhancement that are more deeply integrated into our biology over ones that aren't.
But could you talk maybe a little bit about some of the reasons why you tend to favor the internal methods?
Yeah, I mean, one thing is that I think perhaps there's a level of conscious awareness and conscious understanding that could come with an internal form of enhancement that might be intrinsically valuable. Like, figuring out a mathematical problem by yourself, there's a certain kind of intrinsic satisfaction to that. So there might be those kinds of personal intrinsic rewards associated with the internal forms of enhancement. But I think there's also a political element to this that is interesting, insofar as I think we should be, to some extent anyway, worried about over-reliance on automated systems of decision-making in our public life. And there are ways in which this is being done already that I think are concerning. They're fairly minor at the moment, but you can see a pattern through which they might become more serious.
What would an example be of some of the slippery slopes that we might be on now?
Yeah, I'll give one. There's a guy called Luke Dormel. He wrote a book called The Formula, which is about how algorithms are solving all our problems and creating others. It's a good book. It's kind of a popular level text. But he has a story in there about a guy called John Gass, who was a driver in Massachusetts, who in, I think, November of 2011 received a letter from I think it's a registry of motor vehicles, cancelling his driver's license. And he phoned up the RMV and asked, why has my driver's license been cancelled? He couldn't get an answer initially, but he eventually found out that what happened is that they had recently automated or introduced a new automated system that ran it was a facial recognition algorithm on every driver's photograph stored in their database. And if it found a suspiciously similar match between two photographs, it assumed that the person was using a fake identity, and it automatically canceled the driver's license and sent out a letter canceling the driver's license. And he was told that the burden of proof was on him to prove that he wasn't using a fake identity. They knew that this system would have some false positives. They kind of did this cost-benefit analysis where they said, well, those few false positives were worth the benefits of weeding out cases of criminal identity. But that's just one example of a bureaucratic decision-making process being taken over by an algorithm and reducing our ability to maybe challenge and engage with that process.
There are some things that algorithms could really be our greatest ally, but trying to figure out when to apply an outside algorithm and when not to is going to be a really interesting challenge that we've got for the next many decades.
I think it's an interesting challenge. I think it's one that we're going to encounter more and more in the coming years. And I'd be willing to, again, cede authority or control to algorithms or these automated systems in certain domains, but I'd be most concerned about it in the political domain, insofar as I think like modern liberal democratic states are founded on this notion that, the individual has moral worth, and any decision that affects them, they should be able to understand that decision and engage with that decision and challenge it. And my concern would be that relying on these systems might render them more opaque over time. And I think this might be one reason why we shouldn't rely on externalized automation of decision-making in these domains. We should seek to enhance the human beings who are making those decisions internally, using some kind of internal method of enhancement. That's a very kind of general sketch of the argument.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So thank you so very, very much to John Danaher for joining me for that conversation. I think everybody's probably a fan of participative philosophy to some extent like that, these conversations that you kind of know you're never going to get to an actual clear conclusion where you can say, yes, we solved that problem. I think to a certain extent, if things aren't intractable, they're probably not philosophy. There's a clear solution. It would be mathematics or something like that, a hard science. But nevertheless, I think we can all agree that society and technology are definitely getting to the point where we will be able to directly use technology to affect people's decision-making process, even in things like moral decisions. And thinking about how we want to go about approaching that is really interesting. Should we have the ability to appeal to an outside source for moral solutions to problems, the way that we currently can appeal to something like Google for factual solutions to problems? Like, I don't know how to get from here to there. Google Maps, please tell me. What if you have a moral problem and instead of calling up your best friend or your grandma or whomever you would appeal to for moral guidance, there's this moral supercomputer out there somewhere, or a moral add-on upgrade chip in your head? And if so, who's programming that thing? And is the additional moral source code open source? And who holds the copyright? And all these are really, really valid questions, I think, as far as could this technology conceivably exist in the near future? And if it does, were it implemented, it couldn't help but have far-reaching consequences. So starting to discuss some of these issues now, I think, in a public sphere is probably a pretty darn good idea. And the type of writing and thinking that John's doing is very much more akin, I think, to this structured classical approach, which on the one hand is more restrictive, but on the other hand, it really thoroughly looks at the ideas that are under discussion. And when it does get to an answer point, you can feel pretty confident that, hey, this is a legitimate answer. It doesn't just sound nice, but we've kind of proven in the course of getting to this point in the conversation that what we've arrived at here is correct. If you're into that kind of stuff, I would definitely check out John's blog, philosophicaldisquisitions.blogspot.org. But I'd save that for later. I wouldn't check out anything until I've checked out the Ruthless Listener Retention Gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts. Ruthless Listener Retention Gimmick.
So unbeknownst to me until I read this article, there are blood pressure sensors on the blood vessels on the inside of your lungs. And when these blood vessels sense that you've got higher than usual pressure, they can actually dampen down your nervous system. And one of the things that this does is makes you slightly less sensitive to pain. This dampening mechanism might be why people that have high blood pressure also appear to generally have higher pain thresholds, which is interesting. This made me think about the guys that swim in Arctic waters, the polar bear club. You always see these kind of fat guys that are swimming around in this colder than frozen salt water, which is why it's still liquid, and it just looks insanely cold. But then you're like, well, maybe it's just because these guys have extra body fat, but maybe it's also because guys who are overweight tend to have slightly higher blood pressure, higher pain thresholds, so on and so forth. Anyway, that's not what this article is about. This article is about holding your breath, which is something that anybody can do, apparently has a significant reduction in the pain that you feel. It doesn't reduce the actual amount of pain that you feel that much, but significant in the scientific study sense that almost everybody who tried this got an effect from it. The subjective amount of the pain reduction was not giant. It was from 5.5 on a 10-point scale down to 5, but it worked very consistently. One note that the researcher made was, it doesn't work after the fact. If the pain has already started, this doesn't really seem to do anything. So if a bee stings you by surprise, something like that, no point in holding your breath after the fact. But if it's a pain that you can anticipate, like a doctor giving you a shot, then holding your breath in advance could make it hurt less.
Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast so smart, we have smart in our title, twice.
So we made it to the end of the late night edition, episode number 76 of Smart Drug Smarts. Thank you for hanging around until the end. If you're still here, if you liked what you heard, please do one of the following. Visit smartdrugsmarts.com/census and tell us about yourself, or sign up for our email list, also at smartdrugsmarts.com. Tell a friend about smartdrugsmarts.com. Get a tattoo of the words smartdrugsmarts.com. Nobody's actually done that one yet. I will be back at you next week, once again on Friday, same time, same podcast, and with the same unflagging commitment helping you fine-tune the performance of your own brain. Ooh, happy to tell you also, two episodes, or rather interviews for future episodes recorded just today. So the pipeline is pretty full in the near future. We might even have a couple of overflow episodes. Don't want to make any hand-waving promises just yet, but things are going well. Have a great week and stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only. Although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not. And the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.